Prevention-based tools leave you blind to threats inside your network. By adding network traffic analysis to your SOC, you can find and stop attackers before they make their move. ExtraHop provides complete visibility at enterprise scale. Detect threats 95% faster with machine learning that helps Tier 1 analysts perform like seasoned threat hunters. Visit extrahop.com/Security Weekly to learn why the SANS Institute calls ExtraHop fast and amazingly thorough. That's extrahop.com/Security Weekly. Networks are becoming increasingly complex and fragmented, and digital transformation and DevOps are driving an explosion in network connectivity changes. With each new network connection, cyber attackers may gain another opening to breach or traverse the network. At Tufin, they've pioneered a policy-based approach to network security management using automation and analytics. As a result, you can make network changes in minutes instead of days, reliably and securely. To learn more about Tufin, the security policy company, go to securityweekly.com/Tufin and sign up for a free evaluation. By the end of 2020, 99% of exploited vulnerabilities will be publicly disclosed and known to IT system admins. The consequences of that fact means the burglar will already be in your house because you left the front door wide open by failing to patch known vulnerabilities. How can you keep the threat actors out? Through cloud-based automation, Automox enables you to slam the door on unpatched OS and third-party vulnerabilities across your entire Windows, Mac, and Linux infrastructure. Take advantage of a free trial with Automox to not only see the vulnerability status of your infrastructure, but do something about it within minutes. Start automating the fundamentals of cyber hygiene at securityweekly.com/Automox. That's securityweekly.com/Automox. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Quick announcement: if you'd like to do an interview with us at Black Hat, we've rented a suite in Mandalay Bay. You can go to securityweekly.com/booking. You can reserve your spot for a micro interview. You can tell the world what your solution does in today's world of security, and do participate in an episode of either this show or Paul's Security Weekly. All that on securityweekly.com/booking. I am excited for our guest for this segment. Ruvi Kitov is the chairman and CEO and co-founder, I did get that right, of Tufin, the security policy orchestration company. We were just talking about this problem. Ruvi, it's nice to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, Ruvi, we were just talking about it. Actually, I was thinking about, like when we first got an internet connection at my first job, right? It was like you had the internet connection, you had one firewall, then you had the rest of your network. And then, that technology evolved over time, and we had virtual machines and VMware and all kinds of Cisco primarily gear throughout the network, and we could do policies on our switches and routers and multiple firewalls. Now today we have cloud, 3 different major cloud providers, and we actually started talking about the very granular levels you can get into inside of your applications and all the policies. And really what's happened over time is this has gotten a lot more complex. So I wanted to start, kind of with that problem and the journey that we've been on in terms of trying to manage our security policies.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about historically, 1992, first firewalls started coming out, and people weren't really using the internet that heavily. The world was not all super connected like it is today. So it was pretty simple, and you had a firewall or a couple of firewalls, and you configured rules in them, and the way to manage connectivity was manage the firewall rule base. But then, you fast forward and suddenly you have large enterprises with hundreds, if not thousands of firewalls, sometimes thousands of routers and switches, moving to private cloud. So they all have either a mixture of private cloud, public cloud, or both. So in the private cloud, people are starting to deploy things that do microsegmentation, like VMware NSX. They're starting to use Cisco ACI, other technologies. In the public cloud, obviously, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, that has a network of its own. And people are starting to write applications on Kubernetes. You mentioned that in the show earlier. All those things are either network elements or have a network stack of their own. And they all require some kind of a policy. And you have this, usually a network security team that is small, overworked, and inundated with change requests, right? Yes. So organizations, the organization doesn't stop. You now have, it's all interconnected. you have hundreds, if not thousands, of applications all on the network, and these developers want to make changes all the time.
And that was
And every time you make a change, you might break your own policy.
Yeah, so that happened to me. Now I'm the administrator, so I get to call myself, right? But I set up a development environment at home, and it couldn't talk to my Amazon RDS instance because of the policy in Amazon RDS, right? Now, for me, that's one of my applications, and it's the primary one, so it's a very small example. But now when we talk about enterprises, Ruvi, in the cloud, they've got hundreds, maybe thousands of applications, right?
Yes, and in your case, it's just you, and you're the admin, right? You own the world. And large companies, you have to have separation of duties. You can't let the developers necessarily do whatever they want, right? They'll just open it up completely.
To the world, yeah.
Right. So you have a managed process, right? So you start introducing change control in tools like ServiceNow, Remedy, HPSM. So people have a workflow, they have ticketing, right? So ITSM means a developer in the enterprise IT world, they will open a ticket saying, I want to connect from point A to point B, like you were trying to do. And that ticket will get to the network security team, or whatever you call it, security operations team. That team needs to decide, should we allow that connectivity or not? And usually that's the first challenge, is that most organizations actually don't have a well-defined formalized policy. I mean, it's kind of baffling to believe that a lot of Fortune 1000 companies, it's all based on kind of tribal knowledge, and what did we do last time, and let's look in the firewall and try to figure out what the person before me did.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but most of them actually, maybe somebody in the CISO office, like some architect, has a security architecture of the network. And what I mean by architecture, it means who can talk to whom or what can talk to what. Like, should engineering be able to connect to finance? And should the retail stores be able to connect to the data center? Who gets to say, right? So at some point, somebody sat down and wrote it, and it might be a set of rules. And it's usually a PDF or a Word document collecting dust or in somebody's head. It's usually not a tool that is used to actually decide whether any change that is open a ticket, should we allow that or not? Almost always, they get that ticket, they look at it, and they have triage meetings, they scratch their head, they try to figure it out. Very manual, very error prone.
Yeah, and in my case too, like a container has to talk to a database server or instance on the internet. And you're right, someone has to make that decision. Like when someone works from home, does that go over the VPN? How does it, is that going to introduce a problem if a container goes over the VPN? And then what about right? So there's all these decisions that have to be made by human. It's a very manual process.
Exactly. And you're talking about one app. Now blow that up.
Right.
Fortune 1000, 1,000 apps, right? And you got, network team is separate from the security team. And, you got the people managing DevOps, that's a different group. And you got developers, everything, suddenly to get something done, you get a workflow where let's say you have a ticket, you want to go from a compute instance in AWS all the way back in and cross a couple of firewalls and a router and switch. And actually, you need AWS open. You might need to touch Kubernetes. You need to have routers touched, and you have to have firewalls touched.
Yeah.
That ticket will literally travel from team to team to team, and it might take 1 to 2 weeks from the moment you opened it until it's implemented, which is bad.
In the meantime, the developer's made a copy of the database and is taking it home with them, right?
Yes, shadow IT, exactly.
Yes. That's why. That's a great explanation for why shadow IT is happening today. But even outside of the applications, even just managing firewall rules today, and if you've got, what was our kind of 100 firewalls or more in a large enterprise, right?
Yeah, usually we call like a large is 100 firewalls or more. Mid-sized enterprises between 20 firewalls to 100 firewalls. I think anybody that's got 20 firewalls or more has a level of complexity that they'll need a tool. It'll be difficult for them to keep everything in their head. When you get past the 100 firewall mark, I think you practically lost control unless you have a tool, right? Because if every one of those firewalls has, on average, between 100 to 300 rules, and you get dozens of change requests every week, that's going to be very, very difficult to make. People are doing this complex math of the network in their head all day, not even knowing what the policy really is.
Yeah, how do you know and this is how I traditionally have thought of security policy orchestration, right? Is if I've got even say 20 firewalls, how do I know when I make a rule change, how that's going to impact the whole system? Just like when I write code, I rely on tools to go regression test my changes, right? In firewalls, when I was the firewall administrator for university, I was the regression test, right? And I would go
Yes.
make a change and then go, okay, what's that impact? Try and calculate it before I made the change, but you never really know. And that's what your solution does, right? Is one of the things is help calculate that impact of that change, correct? Is that the kind of the crux
Exactly. So, one part of what we do, kind of the traditional Tufin orchestration suite, and SecureTrack in particular, it helps you define a policy, right? So the type of policy that we talk about, we call it Unified Security Policy or USP. It's where you define what is the world and what can talk to what on your network, right?
at a very
Which
high
networks
level,
are,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
conceptually, like, because right now, if you ask somebody, what's your security policy? If you ask a firewall admin, he'll say, well, look at my Palo or Checkpoint
Yeah.
or Fortinet rule base. Here's my rule base. That's my policy. That is not the policy. That is the implementation or the actual configuration. A policy is a construct that sits above it, which is what do you allow conceptually? Like, what types of things should you allow? And then you configure a firewall rule, right? That's different.
Yes.
So, so the way we look at it, literally in the product, it looks like a matrix of, vertically and horizontally. You define all of your zones, and a zone can be a collection of subnets or networks. And then from any zone to any other zone, you define what is the expected behavior. Kind of when we were kids and there was a distance map, and you want to, like, hey, from New York to Boston, how far of a drive? How many miles is that going to be? And you went to, like, you found New York vertically, and then went to Boston horizontally, and the intersecting cell will tell you the behavior. Like in this case, it'll be tell like how many miles. So you would figure out, okay, however many miles I can drive it, it's going to take this many hours. Here is from zone A to zone B. The intersecting cell would define the behavior. So should you allow it or not?
Yep.
Right? Is this allowed in my policy? And if it is, what ports, under what circumstances? Right? So first, customers define that in Tufin, and then usually they run a scan across their entire environment. A lot of times at this point, they have this oh crap moment where they realize it's, you don't know what you don't know. It's the first time they actually realize all of the misconfigurations they have currently throughout their firewall or network estate. And they take a deep breath.
Yes.
And then they go and try to fix stuff, which could take a week and it could take 6 months, depending on how, how bad it is. And after that cleanup project, usually, they feel like, hey, we're in a good place. We cleaned it up. But then
I like that though, because when I was at the university, right, we had the student body, right? There was a collection of subnets that represented the student body. And we would debate all the time, well, what should they be able to access on the internet? Should the internet be able to access them? And then how should they interact with the rest of the organization? We never sat down at some point and defined that overarching policy. And then it's another realization where you go, well, the student body should never be able to talk to that set of servers over there. When you implement a tool such as yours, your tool goes, no, they totally have access to everything over there, and you have that panic moment, right? Is that essentially how it happens?
Yes, exactly. And so let's say a university that uses our tool suddenly realizes, oh my God, that students actually have access to the system. And if they were to hack that system and get onto the next one next to it, well, they can change grades and they can do all sorts of things that we don't want to do. Influence, I don't know, lab results, whatever you're looking at. So yes, it's exactly that. So our first tools were around defining the policy and making sure that you adhere to the policy. And we got another set of tools that maybe we'll talk about some other time, which have to do with automation. So automating the network change process. Because one of the challenges is that the network change process, like I described, can take between 1 to 2 weeks. And that is no longer acceptable in the world of DevOps and running at the speed of the business. People want to make changes in minutes, right? So how do you automate that risk analysis, the network change design, and the provisioning of changes to do that in minutes instead of days? So we had a set of tools that does that as well. But so everything I described up to now is kind of physical and virtual network, but is not really in the cloud. As in, I've described the flow of classic enterprise IT, which is permission-based, as in, what I mean by that is an app developer opens a ticket in ServiceNow and says, I want to make a change, and that ticket travels over to the network security team who needs to decide, hey, is this compliant or not? And then they go make the changes. That's enterprise IT. The Wild West world of DevOps is, a lot of those DevOps shops actually run in a cloud native capacity. And that's different because in cloud native, they don't ask for permission. I mean, the way we like to think about it, Tufin, enterprise IT is where it's a tightly controlled environment where every change that you make on the network needs to go through network security teams, and you open a ticket. In the cloud, it's where, or in cloud native environments, it's where the developers are the admins of AWS, Azure, Kubernetes. They make changes by themselves. They change their security groups. They reconfigure Kubernetes. They don't ask for permission. And security is actually playing catch up. And so in those environments, we have different tools that actually plug into the CI/CD pipeline and look at Jenkins and GitHub and look at, hey, here's like somebody, for example, might be using CloudFormation templates to reconfigure their security groups. I'm talking about a developer, not a security person, right? A developer has just reconfigured it, and they've got new east-west connectivity that security teams are not even aware of, right? How can we plug into that change, see that change, and set a policy of whether it's allowed or not allowed, and maybe alert the security teams on changes that don't comply with that policy?
I see. So the security team can say, for example, we had a breach a couple of years ago where a Docker API was exposed to the internet, which is a really bad thing, as you well know, right? But the security team can say, like, don't allow this. And if you do, you have to raise an exception to us. We have to have a discussion, but you can't have an unauthenticated, exposed Docker API to the internet because someone's just going to upload a bunch of containers to mine cryptocurrency or launch DDoS attacks, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the challenge is the following. In a tightly controlled environment, it's security can say, hey, we're going to set the rules. You want to make a change, you open a ticket. It's got to go through us vetting it. It could go through a system like Tufin to do it automatically, to check that you're compliant with the policy. Every change goes through us. In cloud native, in some environments that we're seeing, even in large organizations, the developers don't want to go through security reviews at all. And so from an immutable infrastructure perspective, they can't have security stop them. First of all, they don't want to stop for anybody. Right? Yeah. They just want to deploy, right? It needs to be up there in minutes. And if they made a mistake, they want to fix it in the code and rebuild and push that change out to the cloud again. And so the most that security folks can do in that scenario is alert and say, hey, go and fix this quickly, right? And so in two new tools that we have, Orca and Iris, which are plugged into cloud native environments, either in the public cloud or in Kubernetes, we're looking at changes that developers or DevOps folks make, letting security folks define the policies and the guardrails of what's allowed and what's not allowed from a connectivity perspective, east-west. And then every time somebody violates that policy in the CI/CD pipeline, as a developer has stepped outside the bounds, they're going to get an alert, and security teams are going to get an alert, but we're not necessarily going to break the build. We're going to let it continue. They're going to fix it and publish, push out the change that fixes that problem immediately. Unlike the enterprise IT scenario where everything is tightly controlled, and if a firewall engineer does not want to allow a change to occur, they just stop it, right? They don't approve it. So I think that's, it's a very important distinction, is that some applications have tight control and some of them, actually the developers have taken over the world, right? They're not asking for permission. They'll ask for permission to open a firewall rule to have a connection from the cloud go back into the mothership, if you will, or, through a firewall, but not if they're doing east-west, and not if they're opening up all sorts of ports. Like, am I exposing a compute instance out to the internet? They might not ask for permission there. So it was important for us to extend out into that domain as well, so that we cover all bases of everything in the pervasive network, both firewalls, routers, switches, cloud platforms, and both in the enterprise IT scenario and then the pure cloud native DevOps scenario.
And what's interesting, Ruvi, is you used to know what your external IP address space was, right? And you could always kind of fall back on, look, I've got this job. It's going to scan my IP address space and look for anything new that crops up that might be a developer that exposed something to the internet. In the cloud world, yeah, you may not know what that IP address is going to be, perhaps.
Yes.
So you can't scan externally for it.
And it might be something that comes up and down, like an instance comes up, grabs an IP. Yeah, you have no idea. And you go to like Lambda functions and things like that. There's code running that is not even on your system, right? So the attack surface is definitely morphed.
I like your term immutable infrastructure, and I think that's something that a lot of folks that come from the traditional IT and IT security backgrounds, I certainly had a tough time like grasping that concept when I started learning about DevOps. I'm like, there's no longer like this thing that's a server that you can almost see and touch, right? Like it's just applications and infrastructure spinning up and down, and that you need some type of policy orchestration in order to manage that essentially.
Yes, and the key point for us in immutable infrastructure, and I mentioned that briefly a moment ago, is immutable means you can fix it. As in, think of, let's say you have a firewall and you open the dashboard and you make a change. And somebody points out a mistake. Hey, Rule 34, you made a mistake. And normally you would open the dashboard and modify Rule 34. Immutable infrastructure is like you click a button and some script rebuilds the entire firewall config and pushes it out again.
Yep.
Without modifying that rule, because everything's got, like, there should be zero difference between your scripts that build the infrastructure and the configuration itself on the platform. Otherwise, like all these deltas where you start modifying things manually, that's dead in immutable infrastructure.
It is.
What that means, though, is that security practitioners can't stop stuff. Like you can't break a build. You can tell them, hey, go fix it immediately. And you need to kind of live with, in this new world, you need to be able to live with a certain, there's going to be exposure, because if somebody made a mistake and it's in production, there might be 5 or 10 minutes until you push that correction out. And if you can live with that, then go ahead, and that means you're super agile. If you can't live with 5 or 10 minutes of exposure, fall back on enterprise IT, open tickets, tightly controlled. You're not going to have everything run at the speed of like the developers want to run.
Yeah.
Because changes might take half an hour to publish, because somebody's going to need to look at it, unless you're using an automated system, for example, like Tufin, that can automate it down to minutes instead of days.
Yeah, and that's so important today. And I think that once we start overcoming these challenges and the mindset change to immutable infrastructure, when we're there, security is enabled much more greatly than before, right? Because we can fix things much, much faster. Sure, we may have 5 or 10 minutes of exposure, but we can fix things much faster. And it seems that's what Tufin is enabling as well, is for you to continue that change management process, which I think is so important, and not being stuck on a Windows 7 system that's vulnerable, that's running that application, which still happens, right? But I want to get away from that and go to a faster build process.
Absolutely. But and us, we're on the vendor side, and everybody is looking at it, analysts and people that are kind of looking at what's cool and what's new. Obviously, the DevOps and all those things are super cool, and a lot of people are moving there. When we're looking at large enterprises, they're all talking about it. They all have some apps that are running in DevOps.
Yep.
But I would say about 90% of the infrastructure is not there yet. And so if you're looking at large enterprises, the vast majority of changes, still tickets, traditional, opened by developers, going to a network security or security operations team. They need to vet it. And at the end of the day, it goes into Cisco, Palo, Checkpoint, Fortinet, Juniper, one of those. And most of the mission critical applications in large enterprises are not in cloud native yet.
Right.
They're thinking of moving there. They're playing with it. They're doing some work there. But my view, at least, is that over the next several years, you're going to see a shift. In a large enterprise, I think 5 years from now, it's still going to be about 50-50 in terms of on-prem versus cloud. I don't see it flipping and being like 90% cloud, 10% on-prem. And so this complex fragmented infrastructure that you have today, if it's 90% on-prem, 10% cloud, it's going to shift and be 50% on-prem, as fragmented on-prem as it was, and 50% in the cloud.
Right.
A lot of large enterprises actually don't choose one vendor. They do a multi-cloud strategy day one.
Yes.
And so it is becoming even more fragmented moving forward.
Right, because you, like you're saying, you still have that 50% that's fragmented between Cisco, Juniper, Palo, right, in physical infrastructure. Yes. And then you've got, depending on the application, we have these conversations even in our small organization, right? Is this application better suited for Azure, Google Cloud, or Amazon, right? And you may end up with all three just because of the differences between them and the needs of your application.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like different business units and they have different procurement, and somebody swipes their credit card. Initially, shadow IT, they're working on Google, they wrote to their APIs, and to rewrite it a year later is a pain.
Yep.
So they're stuck with it. Now the organization decides, no, we want to go with Azure because we got a great deal from Microsoft. You're stuck. So almost everybody's got multi-cloud. That's just at that layer. And then you have Kubernetes and Docker, and you have all these, like you guys mentioned it on the call today. It's absolutely true. All of these systems have configurations. All these systems have potential security vulnerabilities. They need to be maintained and monitored. That's like, all that is beyond the obvious, which is firewalls, routers, switches, private cloud platforms, so software-defined networking. It's the world as it becomes software-defined. I think it's opening up so many possibilities, and at the same time, all these new possibilities have this variety. Like, you can configure all these things. Well, if you could configure 10 times more things than you could 5 years ago, you got to watch 5 times more things than you did.
Right. Right.
So there are so many options now, and so there's so many ways to. The complexity is so much higher that you have to have specialized tools. At least that's the way we think about it, in order to keep up with everything and make sure we have a policy for everything. Everywhere you have a configuration, in my view, you need a policy.
Yep. No, I agree. And the DevOps tool chain especially, right, is so in fact, developers complain that they've got too many tools that they have to use on a regular basis. And so now that comes down to security, you got to figure out, how do you get a security policy around these things so you're not opening up exposures all the time?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that, and it's a mindset shift, and I think you guys mentioned it as well, when people were thinking about security, maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, it was the tools, and it was essentially first the firewalls. What firewalls do you have? Do you have AV? Do you have vulnerability management? Like, there were several key, let's say, markets, and within those markets, there were several vendors that sold you product. And almost all of them, some of them became commoditized and some of them didn't. But every one of those tools has a configuration, and the configuration stems from a policy. And in many ways, the policy is the brain. It's the logic. Like, you can spend tens of millions of dollars on the best equipment out there, and it's worthless if you have configured the wrong rules, whether it's firewalls or any system that you have. And people spend billions on security, and if it's misconfigured, it's worthless. So obviously, we have a perspective that is suited, to us, because we come from a specific viewpoint. But we believe that policy is critical, because if you don't have the right, if you're not managing a policy, and if you're not checking against the policy, whatever you're doing in security, it doesn't matter if it's firewalls or any other domain, then you're flying blind. Essentially, you're not well managed.
And I will totally back that up, because as we work with a number of different vendors in the security industry, I'll often go to my pen tester friends and I'll be like, have you seen this? What do you think of it? Did it slow you down? Did it stop you? And sometimes I get the answer of, Paul, it's a great product. However, when we come up against it, past couple times, they just didn't configure it properly. So we're able to get past it. Once they configured it properly, wow, is it a huge pain in the butt after that, and it really slows down an attacker, right? I hear that story all the time, Ruvi, and that's exactly what what you're saying is that you have to learn how to configure your tools. Better yet, have a tool that helps you make sure they stay in line.
Absolutely. So to configure the tools, for example, you're giving examples of like how to tighten and harden all sorts of things. Security has become such a complex, multi-layered approach. I mean, if you really want to do security at scale, enterprise, you need, I don't know, 20 different tools, right? And all of them have configuration. And it is complex to the point that you need tools to manage the tools. And some people might find that funny, but if you're not, you have to have something that's going to help you because it's such a massive, complex challenge. And so now there's a class of specialized tools that help you manage everything that you're doing around security, and we fit into that category.
And so, Ruvi, what's a good example of a customer? Obviously, you're not going to name them, right? But that you went in and provided them with your tools, and they said, "Oh my God, that just like saved me so much like risk that we had no idea we had."
Right. So I'll give an example. I can't name them. One of the large, let's say, postal authorities in the Western world. So very large organization, and their SLA was, they need to make a change quickly. Usually, their SLA originally was we got to make a change. I think in 3 days. Mm-hmm. They were failing it. Every change took them 5 days, and they had a team, I think, of 5 people, and they were all making changes all the time. Hundreds of changes on a weekly basis with no policy. So they were flying blind in many ways. So they bought Tufin, SecureTrack, and SecureChange to build a policy and automate the changes. So they were able, with SecureTrack and SecureChange, to do several things. First, they clean up their policy, right? They defined the policy for the first time, cleaned the config, and got to a steady state, clean bill of health.
Reduce the risk.
Next thing, yes, significantly, and increase visibility, right? Which is kind of tied together.
Yep.
And then the next thing is when they started automating, they actually took that team, which was 5 people, and they were able to manage it with dramatically less. So they saved about 80% of their time. They're making changes, and now they can make a change in less than an hour, and that team can do other things. Yes. And it's interesting because
it's important.
Here's an interesting myth that you have in the security space. When you bring automation, so some of what we do is automation oriented. A lot of times, especially with engineers, they feel, oh, this tool is going to automate stuff. I might be automated out of a job. And that is completely irrational. And it's false.
It's not
because
true. Yeah.
Every company we walk into, there are dozens of security projects that are not getting done, high priority, because all the engineers are tied up typing in IP addresses into a firewall console.
I've been there.
Instead of hunting for threats, looking at their detections, all sorts of, there's real security to be done out there, instead of just like trying to figure out whether a ticket in ServiceNow, is compliant with the policy and opening up the console and provisioning the change. Some automated tool can do that, right? And you can have much higher value things to do with that team. Every company that we walk into, they've taken those engineers that are now saved, and they're doing much more interesting things. And they're doing other things, right? It's just, I think it's a matter of time until this network change process is not fully automated by a tool. It just doesn't make sense. It's like the last piece of IT that has not been automated yet, and that's one of the things that we do now.
It's fantastic. Ruvi, that was a great conversation. I could sit here and talk with you for another hour at least. But unfortunately, we have to take a break. And I want to remind everyone to go to securityweekly.com/Tufin if you're interested in learning more. That is their landing page. Make sure that you check them out. So, Ruvi, thank you very much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too. With that, we'll take a short break and come back with our next interview. Stay tuned.